Thank you for joining me in what promises to be a fascinating and deeply insightful journey as we explore one of the most complex and misunderstood conditions in psychology, multiple personality disorder, or as it's now more commonly called, dissociative identity disorder. Today we're going to look at this extraordinary phenomenon through the lens of a man whose ideas revolutionized our understanding of the human mind, Sigmund Freud. The title of our discussion is No One Understands Multiple Personality Disorder Better Than Freud. Now, you might be wondering why Freud? After all, his theories were developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Psychology has evolved dramatically since then, with new diagnoses, new treatments, and new schools of thought. But there's a reason Freud remains foundational. A reason why his work still resonates today, particularly when we talk about complex conditions like multiple personality disorder. Freud's understanding of the mind was revolutionary because he didn't just focus on conscious thought or behavior. He delved into the unconscious, the hidden part of the mind, the part that we're not aware of, but that drives much of our behavior. And this is precisely where multiple personality disorder exists, in the deep, often inaccessible layers of the psyche. Let's start by asking a fundamental question: what is it that makes us who we are? What is it that defines our personality, our sense of self? For most of us, the answer seems straightforward. We have a continuous sense of being the same person throughout our lives. We have memories, beliefs, desires, and fears that all coalesce into what we think of as me. But for those with multiple personality disorder, this sense of self is fractured. Instead of one cohesive identity, there are multiple identities, each with its own memories, thoughts, and desires. Freud would have seen this condition not as something foreign or alien, but as an extreme manifestation of processes that exist in all of us. According to Freud, the human mind is not a unified whole. It's divided into parts that are often in conflict with one another. He famously described the mind as having three components: the ID, the ego, and the superego.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
The ID is the part of us that is driven by primal desires, our need for food, pleasure, and immediate gratification. It's pure impulse, pure instinct. The superego, on the other hand, is the internalized voice of authority, our conscience, the source of guilt, and the enforcer of societal rules and expectations. And between these two forces is the ego, the part of us that mediates between the demands of the IDA and the constraints of the superego. It's the part of us that tries to navigate reality, balancing our desires with the need to fit into society. For most people, this balancing act happens unconsciously. We don't usually stop to think about how our desires are being repressed or how our conscience is guiding our choices. But Freud believed that this dynamic was the root of all psychological tension. When these forces are out of balance, when the ID's desires are too strong, or when the superego is too harsh, psychological problems emerge. Now, let's tie this back to multiple personality disorder. In Freud's view, when the conflict between these parts of the mind becomes too intense, the psyche can fracture. Rather than allowing these opposing forces to coexist within a single identity, the mind creates multiple identities to contain them. In a sense, multiple personalities are a defense mechanism, a way of managing overwhelming psychological conflict. Imagine for a moment the kind of internal conflict that might lead to the development of multiple personalities. Perhaps there is a deep, unacknowledged trauma, something too painful for the conscious mind to process. The mind, in an effort to protect itself, creates an alternative identity to hold that trauma. This new identity might have no memory of the trauma, allowing the person to function in daily life without being overwhelmed by pain. But the trauma doesn't go away. It's still there, lurking beneath the surface, and it may resurface in the form of another personality. Freud would see this as a kind of splitting a division of the self into parts that are kept separate from one another. And this is where Freud's understanding of repression becomes crucial. Repression is the process by which the mind pushes unacceptable thoughts, desires, or memories out of consciousness. But the repressed material doesn't just disappear. It remains in the unconscious, influencing behavior in ways that the person isn't aware of. In the case of multiple personality disorder, the repression is so extreme that it creates entirely new personalities, each one holding different aspects of the person's psyche. One personality might be outgoing and confident, while another is shy and fearful. One might be aggressive and reckless, while another is calm and cautious. Each personality represents a different way of coping with the internal conflict. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Freud believed that all of us experience some degree of splitting. Even in people without multiple personality disorder, there are parts of ourselves that we keep hidden, even from ourselves. We might have desires that we're ashamed of, or memories that we'd rather forget. We might present one version of ourselves to the world, while another, more private version exists beneath the surface. So is multiple personality disorder really that different from the way most of us experience our own minds? Freud would say that it's not. It's simply a more extreme version of something that exists in all of us. We all have multiple selves. The difference is that, for most of us, these selves coexist within a single identity. But for someone with multiple personality disorder, the boundaries between these selves are more rigid, more distinct. Now, before we move on, I want to leave you with a deep question to ponder. How well do you really know yourself? How many parts of your own psyche are hidden from your conscious awareness? And what might happen if those hidden parts were to come to the surface? These are difficult questions, but they are at the heart of Freud's understanding of the mind. And as we continue, we'll delve even deeper into the implications of Freud's theory for understanding multiple personality disorder. Now that we've laid the groundwork, let's go even deeper into the unconscious mind. We've already introduced Freud's concept of the ego and superego, and we've talked about how the mind can fracture into multiple identities as a way of managing conflict. But what exactly is going on in the unconscious mind of someone with multiple personality disorder? And how can Freud help us understand this better than anyone else? Freud believed that the unconscious was like a battlefield, a place where different parts of the psyche are constantly at war with one another. And in the case of multiple personality disorder, this war plays out in a particularly dramatic way. But to understand why, we need to explore one of Freud's most important insights: the role of trauma in shaping the unconscious. For Freud, trauma was the key to understanding many psychological disorders. He believed that when we experience something overwhelmingly painful or frightening, the mind doesn't simply process it and move on. Instead, the trauma is often repressed and pushed out of conscious awareness because it's too painful to deal with. But repressed trauma doesn't disappear. It stays in the unconscious, influencing behavior in ways that the person doesn't fully understand. In the case of multiple personality disorder, Freud would argue that the trauma is so severe that the mind creates entirely new personalities as a way of managing it. Each personality holds a different aspect of the trauma, allowing the person to function in daily life without being overwhelmed by the full weight of their pain. But here's the catch: these personalities are often unaware of one another. They exist in a state of dissociation, meaning that when one personality is in control, the others are effectively turned off. This is where Freud's concept of repression becomes crucial. Repression is the process by which the mind pushes unacceptable thoughts, desires, or memories out of consciousness. But the repressed material doesn't just disappear. It remains in the unconscious, influencing behavior in ways that the person isn't aware of. In the case of multiple personality disorder, the repression is so extreme that it creates entirely new personalities, each one holding different aspects of the person's psyche. One personality might be outgoing and confident, while another is shy and fearful. One might be aggressive and reckless, while another is calm and cautious. Each personality represents a different way of coping with the internal conflict. It's like the unconscious is a battlefield, where different parts of the psyche are fighting for control. And in the case of multiple personality disorder, this battle is particularly intense. Each personality is a soldier in this war, trying to protect the person from the overwhelming pain of their trauma. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Freud believed that all of us experience some degree of splitting. Even in people without multiple personality disorder, there are parts of ourselves that we keep hidden, even from ourselves. We might have desires that we're ashamed of, or memories that we'd rather forget. We might present one version of ourselves to the world, while another, more private version exists beneath the surface. So is multiple personality disorder really that different from the way most of us experience our own minds? Freud would say that it's not. It's simply a more extreme version of something that exists in all of us. We all have multiple selves. The difference is that, for most of us, these selves coexist within a single identity. But for someone with multiple personality disorder, the boundaries between these selves are more rigid, more distinct. Now, before we move on, I want to leave you with a deep question to ponder. How well do you really know yourself? How many parts of your own psyche are hidden from your conscious awareness? And what might happen if those hidden parts were to come to the surface? These are difficult questions, but they are at the heart of Freud's understanding of the mind. And as we continue, we'll delve even deeper into the implications of Freud's theory for understanding multiple personality disorder. Now that we've explored the intricate workings of Freud's model of the mind, the ID, ego and superego, and how trauma and repression can lead to the fragmentation of the self, it's time to dive into the final and perhaps most profound aspect of this journey, the unconscious battlefield. We've touched on how Freud viewed the unconscious as a place of conflict, where different parts of the psyche, often representing conflicting desires or emotions, wage war with one another. But in the case of multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, this war isn't just metaphorical, it plays out in a very real and tangible way. Freud's genius lies in his ability to recognize that the mind, particularly the unconscious mind, isn't a peaceful landscape. It's a chaotic, often turbulent place where unresolved conflicts, unprocessed traumas, and repressed desires live on, influencing both our thoughts and behaviors, whether we are aware of it or not. And in understanding this, we can begin to see how multiple personality disorder can be seen as a magnified version of something that happens in all of us. This brings us to a crucial question: why do we repress certain aspects of ourselves? Why do we, as Freud would argue, split off parts of our own psyche rather than face them? The answer, Freud believed, lies in the nature of trauma and the mind's capacity or lack thereof to deal with overwhelming pain. Freud's genius lies in his ability to recognize that the mind, particularly the unconscious mind, isn't a peaceful landscape. It's a chaotic, often turbulent place where unresolved conflicts, unprocessed traumas, and repressed desires live on, influencing both our thoughts and behaviors, whether we are aware of it or not. And in understanding this, we can begin to see how multiple personality disorder can be seen as a magnified version of something that happens in all of us. This brings us to a crucial question: why do we repress certain aspects of ourselves? Why do we, as Freud would argue, split off parts of our own psyche rather than face them? The answer, Freud believed, lies in the nature of trauma and the mind's capacity or lack thereof to deal with overwhelming pain. Trauma, especially when experienced at a young age, can create fissures in the psyche. When a child is exposed to something too painful to process, abuse, neglect, or even the loss of a loved one, the mind often cannot integrate that experience into the child's developing sense of self. In Freud's view, the mind does what it can to protect itself. It compartmentalizes the trauma, pushing it out of conscious awareness. But that trauma doesn't simply disappear. It remains in the unconscious, where it continues to affect the person's life in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. For someone with multiple personality disorder, this process of compartmentalization goes to the extreme. Instead of just repressing the trauma, the mind creates entirely new identities to hold it. Each personality, in a sense, serves as a container for the pain, allowing the person to function in daily life without being overwhelmed by the full weight of their trauma. But here's where Freud's understanding of the unconscious becomes particularly relevant. These different personalities aren't separate in the way that different people are separate. They are all part of the same psyche, even if they don't interact with one another. And this is where the unconscious battlefield comes into play. Freud believed that the unconscious is always active, even when we're not aware of it. It's constantly working behind the scenes, influencing our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And in the case of someone with multiple personality disorder, the unconscious is working overtime. Each personality is fighting for control, not just of the person's behavior, but of their very sense of self. This internal battle often manifests in ways that are bewildering to both the person experiencing it and those around them. One personality might have no memory of what another personality has done. One personality might hold all of the anger and aggression, while another is gentle and passive. One might be deeply traumatized, while another is seemingly unaffected. And yet, all of these personalities are part of the same person, fragments of a single psyche that has been shattered by trauma. In this sense, Freud's understanding of multiple personality disorder can teach us something profound about the nature of the human mind. We all have different parts of ourselves that are in conflict. We all have desires that we repress, emotions that we don't fully understand, and parts of our psyche that we keep hidden, even from ourselves. For most of us, these conflicts don't lead to the creation of multiple personalities. But they do lead to internal tension, anxiety, and sometimes even psychological symptoms. So, what does Freud's approach offer in terms of practical advice for understanding ourselves and dealing with our own internal conflicts? The first lesson is one of radical honesty. Freud believed that the path to psychological health lies in bringing the unconscious into consciousness and facing the parts of ourselves that we would rather ignore or deny. This is no easy task. It requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, to acknowledge desires that we might find shameful or irrational, and to deal with emotions that we've been avoiding for years. But Freud also believed that this process was essential for living a full, authentic life. As long as we keep parts of ourselves hidden in the unconscious, they will continue to influence us in ways that we don't understand. They will manifest in our dreams, in our relationships, in our anxieties, and in our behaviors. And until we bring them into the light of consciousness, we will remain at the mercy of forces that we cannot control. This brings us to another deep question: what are you avoiding in your own life? What parts of yourself have you repressed, hidden, or denied? And more importantly, what might happen if you allowed those parts of yourself to come to the surface? The second lesson from Freud is that healing often requires an integration of these different parts of ourselves. In the case of multiple personality disorder, this means helping the person to integrate their various identities into a cohesive whole. But even for those of us without this disorder, integration is still a crucial part of psychological health. We all have different selves that we present in different situations: the self that we show at work, the self that we show to our friends, the self that we keep hidden even from those closest to us. And while it's natural to have different aspects of our personality, problems arise when these different parts of ourselves are in conflict. Freud would argue that the goal is not to eliminate these different parts of ourselves, but to find a way to bring them into harmony. This requires a deep level of self-awareness, a willingness to acknowledge and accept all aspects of ourselves, even the ones that we find uncomfortable or unpleasant. It requires us to confront our own contradictions, to recognize the ways in which we are at war with ourselves, and to find a way to reconcile those conflicts. The third and final lesson is that the path to self-understanding is not a linear one. Freud's method of psychoanalysis was notoriously long and complex, often requiring years of therapy to uncover the hidden layers of the unconscious. But Freud believed that this was necessary because the mind is not a simple, straightforward place. It's a labyrinth, full of twists and turns, hidden chambers, and secret passageways. And if we are to truly understand ourselves, we must be willing to embark on a journey into the depths of our own psyche. This journey can be difficult and disorienting. We may uncover things about ourselves that we would rather not know. We may have to face painful memories, unresolved traumas, and uncomfortable truths. But Freud would argue that this is the only way to achieve true psychological freedom. As long as we are controlled by unconscious forces that we don't understand, we are not truly free. We are prisoners of our own minds, locked in a battle that we don't even realize is taking place. So, as we conclude this journey through Freud's understanding of multiple personality disorder, I want to leave you with one final question: how willing are you to confront the hidden parts of yourself? How deep are you willing to go in your quest for self-understanding? And what might you discover if you were to embark on a journey into the depths of your own unconscious mind? Freud believed that the answers to these questions hold the key to not only understanding multiple personality disorder, but to understanding the human condition itself. We are all, in a sense, fractured beings, divided between our desires, our fears, and our conscience. But the more we understand these internal conflicts, the closer we come to achieving a sense of wholeness, of integration, and of peace. Thank you for joining me on this deep exploration of Freud's insights into multiple personality disorder. It's a journey that challenges us to look not only at the lives of others, but at our own minds in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately profoundly rewarding.